A great place to begin is to imagine the era in which he came of age. The mid-20th century stands out as an epoch of seismic change for the United States, and the Kennedys were at the heart of it. In the years just after World War II, Americans grappled with the new shape of world politics, the emergent Cold War, and the rise of a suburban middle class. On the surface, it was a time of optimism and national confidence. The American dream was glittering on the horizon. Yet beneath that hopeful veneer, there were cracks, racial injustices, class divides, and the complexities of forging peace in an increasingly volatile nuclear age. In this complex swirl of hope and fear, few families symbolized wealth, ambition, and tragedy quite like the Kennedys. Today we'll delve into Ted Kennedy's life, from the innocence of childhood in a privileged yet deeply complicated family, to the swirling controversies that tested the limits of his resilience all the way to the final chapter of a lifetime spent championing the less fortunate. This is a story of loyalty, heartbreak, redemption, and above all, the power of perseverance. Born in Boston in 1932, Ted Kennedy was the baby of the family. He was the 9th child of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. They were Catholics of Irish heritage who had ascended to high society, much to the fascination of the public and the press. The patriarch Joseph was a savvy businessman and political operator, and he poured his considerable resources and expectations into his children. In this environment, Ted grew up watching older siblings forging new paths. They exemplified that distinctive mix of old-fashioned paternal discipline and modern American ambition. Not only were they privileged, they were taught an ethic of striving for public recognition and service. The Kennedys often looked perfect from the outside, but perfection was the product of pressure. It was said in hushed circles that each child felt the weight of Joseph's demands to achieve greatness, to continue elevating the Kennedy legacy. With so many siblings chasing lofty dreams, Ted likely assumed there was little chance he'd become the political star. In fact, for a while he almost seemed to want a different life. And yet, so much of Ted's formative years were shaped by watching his father engineer the political fortunes of his elder brothers. Ted's own early life wasn't free of troubles. He was a bit awkward academically and got into occasional mischief. In high school, people described him as friendly, likable, but not necessarily remarkable. It's revealing that his father arranged for him to attend multiple private preparatory schools, each time hoping a new environment would help him thrive. He was known to have the resilience to fit in, to make friends, but he never shook the sense that his older siblings were the brilliant stars of the family. He seemed content with that at times, even if every so often he quietly wrestled with expectations that were both colossal and elusive. Attending Harvard University, where the Kennedy name was already famed, would turn into a minor scandal for young Ted. Many fans of the Kennedy clan might remember the story of how Ted was caught cheating on an exam. The details. He had a friend take a Spanish test in his place because he was dangerously close to failing. His father's wrath was immediate. Ted was forced to withdraw from Harvard for a couple of years, do a stint in the U.S. Army, and then return to resume his education. As humiliating as that was for Ted and the family, it was also a transformative experience. It taught him early on what it felt like to be publicly chastised and how to pick yourself up when the entire world is watching. Few realize how close this incident came to derailing his prospects altogether, but it also instilled in Ted a drive to redeem himself and prove that despite mistakes, he was worthy of carrying the torch. The older Kennedys were forging stories of their own. Joseph Jr., the eldest, had died heroically in World War II. John Fitzgerald Jack Kennedy had become a war hero himself thanks to his leadership of PT-109 in the Pacific, and by 1960, he was elected the 35th President of the United States. Robert, or Bobby, was a driving force in the political arena, known for his fierce commitment to justice and his skillful legal mind. Each brother possessed a distinct persona, but the synergy was powerful. The relentless spotlight shining on the family only intensified. Their tragedies and triumphs became front-page news. And there, in the background, was Ted, who in 1962 gained a place in the U.S. Senate, representing Massachusetts, filling notably the seat left vacant by Jack when he ascended to the presidency. It was a seat the family practically considered a birthright, but Ted still needed to earn it, navigating party politics and public scrutiny. During those early Senate years, Ted's style often contrasted with that of his brothers. He was seen by some as less articulate, more apt to speak in a friendly, open-ended way instead of Jack or Bobby's razor-sharp rhetorical style. Reporters would catch glimpses of him fumbling a point here or there. For a while there was a sense that Ted might be a placeholder, holding the seat warm for the next era of Kennedys. That assumption would be overturned, however, as Ted came into his own. He discovered a knack for forging friendships in the Senate, behind-the-scenes negotiations, and championing legislation that demanded empathy and open-mindedness, early glimpses of a more inclusive politics. And yet heartbreak seemed to stalk the Kennedys. Ted's introduction to national tragedy would come in November 1963, with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The country was in shock, and for Ted, losing Jack was a devastating blow. He'd looked up to his older brother for so many years. Their father, Joseph Sr., suffered a stroke 2 years earlier and could offer only limited support, leaving the once powerful patriarch a shadow of his former self. Grief continued relentlessly when Robert F. Kennedy, Ted's political ally, confidant, and moral compass, was assassinated in June 1968. Those years battered the family spirit. It was as if a great force of hope had been cut down. Suddenly Ted, the youngest, was the surviving Kennedy brother who had to bear the full weight of the family name. A rarely discussed anecdote from that time reveals the depth of Ted's mourning. A close acquaintance of the Kennedys once recounted that just days after Bobby's funeral, Ted confided in him that he felt as though he had lost half of himself. He seemed momentarily paralyzed by sadness. Instead of reviling public life, he found some solace in it. He threw himself further into Senate duties, maybe hoping that dedicating himself fully to legislation would mend that emptiness, or at the very least keep him too busy to dwell on personal pain. But the tragedies overshadowing Ted's life were far from over. In June 1964, he'd narrowly escaped death in a plane crash that killed 2 others and left Ted badly injured. His back was broken in multiple places, and he would suffer chronic pain for the rest of his life, occasionally relying on prescription medication that later fueled rumors of dependence. A lesser-known detail is that during his lengthy recovery, he was forced to lie absolutely still for weeks. Visitors would see him in a hospital bed looking gaunt and exhausted, but maintaining that trademark grin. In interviews much later, he would mention that recuperating from the crash forced him to reflect deeply on what he wanted from life. He recognized how precarious existence can be. That near-death experience, combined with the violent loss of both John and Robert, forged within him a steely determination. If fate was going to take so much away, he resolved to use every day he had left for some meaningful service. He also felt an unspoken obligation to act as a surrogate father figure to Bobby's children and a caretaker for the broader family. Many who interacted with Ted behind closed doors say he was the one who'd gather everyone, talk them through emotional upheavals, remind them to carry on. There was an emotional generosity about him that endured, even as he faced crippling personal loss. Friends later marveled that the same man who'd hold the Senate floor in a fiery legislative debate one day would drop everything to attend a niece's school recital or a nephew's sports match the next. Beyond the politics, Ted was a family man, albeit one caught in a storm of public expectations and hidden heartbreak. And then, of course, came Chappaquiddick in July 1969, arguably the most infamous incident of Ted's life. In many retellings, the tragedy is reduced to a few lines. Mary Jo Kopechny, a young campaign worker, died in a car Ted had driven off a bridge late at night. Questions about that night's events, why it took so long to report the accident, how exactly the car ended up in the water, have haunted Ted's legacy ever since. Even decades later, Chappaquiddick remains shrouded in controversy. Yet there's also an emotional dimension that often goes overlooked. He had, by his own admission, panicked after the accident, and his subsequent actions were seen as reflecting political calculation over moral duty. The moral outrage from the public was immediate and intense, and many believed it tarnished forever whatever future national ambitions he might have had. A lesser-known detail is that in the immediate aftermath, Ted retreated to the family compound in Hyannisport in absolute despair. One close friend found him pacing the lawn near dusk, murmuring over and over his regrets about not having done more to save Mary Jo. That quiet admission of guilt, shared in a moment of total vulnerability, rarely surfaces in the typical public narrative, which tends to highlight only the cynical side of politics. It's also worth mentioning that Mary Jo Kopechny's family remained mostly private, seeking to grieve away from the public eye. Ted paid a settlement that was disclosed at the time, but many deeper questions about accountability and authenticity remain. This scandal effectively closed the door on the possibility of Ted running for the presidency in 1972 or 1976, though that door would open slightly in 1980 before shutting again. Moving forward, the 1970s found Ted grappling with his own complex personal life. Married to Joan Bennett Kennedy since 1958, he watched as their union started to crack under the twin burdens of relentless public scrutiny and personal tragedies. Joan faced struggles with alcohol and was hospitalized for exhaustion and stress on several occasions. Meanwhile, Ted's own coping mechanisms at times veered into heavy drinking and rumored infidelities. The couple divorced in 1982. This was a painful period for both, but it was overshadowed by the ambitions and responsibilities that Ted felt in the Senate, where he was steadily amassing a reputation as one of the most effective legislators, especially on issues related to health care, education, and civil rights. One rarely mentioned detail about Ted's legislative style is the empathy he carried into negotiations. He would spend hours speaking directly to constituents, teachers, parents, medical patients, and incorporate their stories into his policy proposals. A staffer from those days recalled how Ted once spent hours reading personal letters from parents of children with disabilities. He then insisted on drafting specific legislative provisions to address their concerns. That staffer later described how one day, in the midst of a busy Senate schedule, Ted spontaneously decided to phone one of those parents just to say, "I heard your story. I see you. I'm working on this." She reportedly burst into tears on the other end of the line. That brand of interpersonal warmth was Ted's calling card, but his public reputation seesawed during those years. For Republicans and conservative critics, Ted symbolized big government liberalism at its peak. They painted him as an out-of-touch elitist with reckless personal behavior. Others saw him as an indispensable champion for the marginalized, a privileged man who nonetheless devoted his career to uplifting the less fortunate. This tension was the hallmark of Ted's entire public life. He was a Kennedy, wealthy, well-connected, deeply flawed, but he was also Ted, a man shaped by tragedy, faith, familial devotion, and a stubborn insistence that government could be a force for progress. To fully appreciate his endurance, consider the mid-1970s. Watergate had just destroyed much of America's trust in political leaders. Distrust in Washington soared. Yet through that tumult, Ted's standing in Massachusetts remained surprisingly robust. He was re-elected repeatedly, often by large margins, eventually serving 9 terms in the Senate, nearly half a century of continuous service. This longevity is unparalleled for someone so relentlessly dogged by controversy in the media. Behind the headlines in meeting rooms and committees, Ted earned a reputation as a pragmatic dealmaker. He fought for extended civil rights legislation, immigration reform, and perhaps most famously, health care, an issue that would define his later career. He had the ability to cross the aisle, forging friendships with conservative colleagues who admired the gusto with which he approached negotiations, even when they fundamentally disagreed. By the late 1970s, speculation ramped up that Ted might challenge President Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination in 1980. Indeed, there was a groundswell of support among Democrats who felt Carter had been ineffective. Ted's last name still carried a fabled weight, and he was frequently asked if he would run, if he would finally fulfill that generational destiny. The memory of Chappaquiddick loomed heavily, not to mention a personal reluctance to expose himself to the withering glare of a presidential campaign. Ultimately, he did run. In a dramatic move, he announced his candidacy, but it never fully caught fire. A fumbled television interview, persistent questions about the Kopechne tragedy, and a lackluster campaign organization hindered him from the start. He lost the nomination to Carter. Famously, in his concession speech, Ted proclaimed, "The work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die." That statement would become an enduring motto, one that signified that while the presidency was not in his future, his broader mission was far from over. Over the ensuing decades, Ted transformed into a lion in the Senate, someone whose legislative record became monumental in scope. He poured energy into reforms like the Voting Rights Act extensions, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and expansions of health coverage for children. He championed labor rights, minimum wage increases, and improvements in education funding. He saw government not as a static institution, but a moral instrument meant to improve people's lives. Even critics admitted that if you needed to pass a major bill, you wanted Ted on your side. The label Lion of the Senate was coined to capture that blend of longevity, passion, and skill in shaping legislation. His second marriage to Victoria Reggie in 1992 introduced a new chapter of stability in his personal life. She became a major source of emotional support, helping him reduce drinking and focus more steadily on legislative goals. Despite this personal and professional renaissance, controversies still found him. In 1991, the nation was captivated by the Clarence Thomas Supreme Court confirmation hearings, during which Anita Hill's allegations of sexual harassment came to light. There were calls for Ted to recuse himself from the Judiciary Committee due to his own checkered personal history. Critics felt he had lost moral standing on issues of personal conduct. Ted, for the most part, remained measured, neither fully retreating from the process nor dominating it. But it was a reminder that the shadows of past scandals never completely disappeared. They lingered, occasionally bursting into the open whenever the national conversation turned to ethics or personal responsibility. A further complexity in Ted's life was the multiple tragedies involving his extended family. The Kennedys seemed locked in a perpetual cycle of heartbreak. His nephew John F. Kennedy Jr. died in a plane crash in 1999, a trauma that triggered flashbacks of the many young Kennedys lost too soon. Once more, Ted was there for the family. He delivered a moving eulogy at John Jr.'s memorial, once again playing the role of the stable anchor in a family that had long been battered by fate. Peering beneath the surface, one might wonder how a man who endured so much heartbreak managed to remain so public, so engaged. One longtime friend offered this perspective. Ted thrived on a sense of mission. Every time tragedy struck, he turned that sorrow into a drive to protect the vulnerable. He once remarked in a quiet moment, "For all the losses, I've also been given a purpose." That sense of purpose propelled him into the battles he considered most significant, especially healthcare. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Ted was an unwavering voice pushing for expanded coverage, particularly for children. He believed healthcare was a fundamental human right years before that stance became mainstream in American politics. Of course, historical debates persist regarding Ted's effectiveness. Some argue that his compromise-laden approach sacrificed core democratic principles, and that his stance frequently shifted over the decades for political expediency. Others hail him as the greatest legislator of his generation, citing the hundreds of bills he sponsored or co-sponsored that became law. Ironically, both views might hold some truth. He was a politician, after all, and part of politics is recognizing the art of the possible, the necessity of forging alliances, even with those whose ideologies clash with one's own. It's also worth exploring the complexity of his personal beliefs. Some remember him as a devout Catholic who struggled with the Church's conservative stance on issues like abortion or LGBTQ rights. Initially, he was cautious about stepping too far from traditional church teachings, but as the years passed, his position evolved. By the end of his career, he was squarely in favor of reproductive rights and LGBTQ equality, rare for a man of his background at that time. Though not unique among progressive Catholics, he took a nuanced approach, acknowledging that people of faith can wrestle with moral questions, but still support the law's role in safeguarding liberties for all citizens. Ted's personal stories occasionally break through the partisan narratives. One detail that emerges from interviews with staffers and close friends is that Ted had a remarkable memory for birthdays and personal details. He'd track which staff member had a child's recital coming up, which colleague was celebrating a milestone. This personal touch expanded his political capital. People on both sides of the aisle felt he respected them as individuals, not just pawns in a legislative game. This approach served him well over decades, giving him a Rolodex of alliances even in the most bitterly divided political climates. If we consider the broader consequences of his storied career, there are several enduring legacies. For one, he championed civil rights legislation that built on the foundation laid by the civil rights movement and successive landmark rulings. His name is attached to expansions of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which transformed the demographic future of the United States. He was an early voice on the issue of apartheid in South Africa, pushing for sanctions and global condemnation. And his fervent advocacy for healthcare reform culminated in his endorsement of the Affordable Care Act during the final phase of his life. He famously called universal health care the cause of his life, believing it was the unfinished business of the New Deal and the Great Society. Yet it would be incomplete to conclude his story without acknowledging the final act of his life. In 2008, at the age of 76, he was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. True to form, he refused to withdraw from the world. Instead, he made surprise appearances in the Senate, passionately advocating for the healthcare reform he had championed for decades. There's an emotional moment often replayed in the minds of those who were there. In July 2008, Ted arrived at the Capitol after surgery to cast a critical vote. Senators from both sides stood up and applauded as he walked onto the floor, evidence of the respect he commanded, even from longtime adversaries. It was a poignant tableau. A man who had spent his life dedicated to service, forging legislation to protect the ill and vulnerable, now grappling with a terminal illness and still refusing to yield until his work was done. Privately, he sought solace at his beloved family compound in Hyannisport, near the same waters that had shaped so many Kennedy memories. He spent time with his wife, Vicki, and the extended family. He also wrote a memoir, an attempt to reckon with his life's achievements and regrets, titled True Compass. Readers caught a glimpse of a man who had navigated extraordinary sorrow and triumph, who felt deep remorse for mistakes, and who tried in his final years to hold on to hope for the nation's future. It was in many ways a farewell letter to the American people, an acknowledgement of how deeply he had shaped and been shaped by political life. When he passed away in August 2009, there was a national outpouring of emotion. Media outlets replayed footage of him eulogizing his brothers, of him championing health care, of him enjoying family sailboats off the coast of Cape Cod. Politicians from all ends of the spectrum delivered tributes, recalling that if you wanted results, Ted was the senator you visited first. And yet, the commentary also inevitably touched on the complexities, his flaws and personal demons, the Kopechny tragedy that overshadowed every mention of his name, the question of whether or not his privilege shielded him from accountability. Historians will grapple with these contradictions for generations to come, but for many Americans, and especially for those in Massachusetts, the immediate sense was that they had lost a passionate advocate who for nearly 5 decades had been a constant in an ever-shifting political sea. And so Ted Kennedy's story reverberates even now, over a decade after his death. His imprint on policies that affect millions remains visible. That alone testifies to his significance. But beyond policy, his life and legacy reflect a deeply human story. The youngest member of a legendary family thrust repeatedly into heartbreak, forced to navigate personal failings while under a microscope, and ultimately forging a path marked by both scandal and genuine public service. It's a reminder that iconic names do not guarantee easy lives, that privilege does not preclude suffering, and that personal redemption can be sought even if it remains partially elusive. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching.